2017 margin protection. First of all, I just appreciate everybody's attendance that's maybe viewing this presentation. This first slide is just a kind of an overview disclaimer, just essentially stating that this information is current as of today, which is August 4th of 2016. On occasion, or may change something, so we just want to make sure that you make sure the version of the presentation is current before using it, or understanding that this should be current though through the 2017 crop year. This is an overview of margin protection. It's going to be somewhat detailed, but not quite as intense as some of our longer presentations. I'm going to kind of start with an introduction and kind of walk through some of the whole kind of standard points with regards to margin protection. Kind of walk through how the coverage is established, and then sort of end with a summary example. So we'll kind of get going here. First of all, this pilot was first approved by the FCIC Board of Directors for the 2016 crop year. These are the states, crops, and counties where the pilot is currently available. This is the same states and counties where the pilot program was available in 2016. You can see corn and soybeans in the state of Iowa, wheat across kind of the northern plains, Minnesota, Montana, North and South Dakota, that's spring wheat. And then rice in select counties in Arkansas, California, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Texas. Sales closing dates. Really important, particularly for corn, soybeans, and spring wheat, as the sales closing date for margin protection is in the fall prior to technically the year of insurance. And that caught a lot of people by surprise for the 2016 crop year. And we're hoping that for 2017, the awareness of the sales closing date being so much earlier is out there, and that more agents and more producers get an opportunity to see if this margin protection fits in their risk management plan well ahead of the September 30th sales closing date. The sales closing dates for rice, they're exactly the same as the sales closing dates for the MPCI programs in those pilot states and counties. It is kind of important to understand why the sales closing dates are so early. We're essentially going to establish an expected margin. We do need some time between when producers are making decisions for the next crop year to price those commodities and those inputs, and have a several months where that price ultimately can go up or go down, and really starting that process when the fall of the year before the crop is actually planted, when most producers are actually making those decisions and buying or contracting for those input quantities ahead of the next crop year. This is just a slide that shows the margin protection page on the Risk Management Agency website. This can be clicked off of their main website by clicking on crop policies and pilots, and then clicking on margin protection. There's a lot of information on RMA's website. QBE NAU also has a very similar information and additional presentations and so on margin protection as well. But just essentially on this website, you have a summary of changes for 2017. There were some changes, don't really impact coverage per se, so I'm not going to touch on many of those changes in this presentation. Some really good fact sheets and frequently asked questions documents, the policy provisions, the price provisions, and a link to the price discovery, which we're going to talk about here as we get going through this presentation with regards to projected and harvest prices. This is just an overview of the specific policy documents. You have a margin protection plan provision, 17MP. Again, these were revised from the 2016 crop year and are current for 2017. You have a basic plan provision for margin protection. Then you have specific crop provisions, a very short documents for corn, rice, soybeans, and wheat. And then a margin price provision document that includes 3 sections. Section 1 is a general section. 2 is the establishment of the projected and harvest prices for the commodity. Section 3 is a section that describes the projected and harvest price periods for the inputs subject to price change. And the margin price provision document is very similar to RMA's commodity exchange price provisions, which are used for all of the revenue protection kinds of policies for the same crops that we're ensuring margin protection for under MPCI. And then finally, there's a really, really good margin protection insurance standards handbook that goes into a lot more detail on setting policies up and the provisions and walking through loss adjustment and those kinds of things. So let's get into what margin protection is all about. So what is margin protection? And I'll back up just a quick second here. This was largely initiated out of requirements in the 2014 Farm Bill. Congress asked RMA to work on establishing some type of margin protection program. This was actually a pilot program that was submitted to the FCIC board by Watson Associates and Egg Risk out of Iowa, or Farm Risk out of Iowa. It's an exceptionally new area-based insurance plan, provides coverage against an unexpected decrease in a producer's operating margin, which is revenue less input cost. Very, very different from your traditional MPCI in that we're adding to what we typically insure yield and price to ensuring movement in prices of selected inputs. Margin protection uses county level estimates of revenue and average input costs to establish the amount of coverage and indemnity payments, and it provides protection against decreases in margin. When you think about it, you think about a producer in a county, and more specifically, since this is an area plan, let's look at it from the perspective of a county. And what could change the margin for a producer if it was producing all of that commodity in the county? Well, number one, if the county yields went down, certainly there's an expectation of yield out there, and a producer is budgeting off of that. And if that yield doesn't come in like it was expected, that's going to reduce the producer's projected margin. Another thing, you can have a consistent yield, but the price of the commodity drops between the time when a producer is making those decisions and those expectations and when the crop is actually harvested. And if that crop price goes down, that's going to decrease that margin for that producer. And the third thing, and an important thing that hasn't been done in the past, is what happens if the yield and the prices are stable, but yet the cost to the grower goes up in terms of planting and taking his crop to harvest. And an increase of selected inputs, prices could ultimately also reduce the producer's margin. So their revenue from their commodities stays level, but the cost to produce those commodities goes up. Margin protection is designed to protect against those types of risks and any combination of those perils. It is important to understand that it is an area-based average for a county kind of policy, and it may not reflect a producer's individual experience. Now, this is a very busy spreadsheet, and as I put on the top of this spreadsheet, I'm going to start with the end in mind. So really, kind of give you an idea more specifically using an example, what we're going to cover in this presentation and how margin works that hopefully will make the rest of this presentation make more sense. So if you look at the spreadsheet, everything on the left-hand side of the spreadsheet is the margin protection information at sign-up. So this would be in the fall, the year before the crop, for corn, soybeans, and spring wheat. And it would be in January, February for rice. Everything on the right-hand side of the spreadsheet is the same information modified by those things in the policy that change between when the insurance is purchased in the fall or the early spring and when the producer harvests the crop. Final and expected and final county yields, harvest prices, and projected prices. Those are the things that are going to impact whether or not an insurance payment is going to be made. So I'm going to do a really quick overview of this slide, and then we're going to end the presentation with this very same slide. So at sign up, spring week, this is Cass County, North Dakota. You have an expected county yield, which is a yield RMA published in the actual documents for 2016 for margin protection spring wheat of just 50.7 bushels per acre. This is a yield very commensurate to what RMA establishes under an area of risk protection plan. RMA projected a spring wheat price in Cass County based off the Minneapolis Grain Exchange price discovery period, which we'll cover. Last fall was announced at $5.61. So the producer's total expected revenue per acre for their spring wheat in Cass County, based on these numbers, is $284.43. Now, the margin protection program has an established amount of, or a selected amount of inputs. These inputs are broken into fixed inputs and variable inputs. Inputs where the price doesn't change, variable inputs that are subject to price change during the insurance year. For spring wheat in Cass County, there's 4 different kinds of fixed inputs that are being used for the margin protection program. All of these specific inputs were selected by extension and university personnel in these areas that are very familiar with the production of the crop, choosing those kinds of inputs that potentially should be measured and could impact the producer's expected margin. The inputs subject to price change also have a mechanism to measure that price change during the year. So for spring wheat in Cass County, fixed inputs, seed cost, maintenance cost per acre, chemicals and lubrication, total seed cost, for example, $20.83 an acre. You have all of the fixed input costs. You have $73.62 in Cass County of fixed input cost. The margin protection program also measures 5 variable input costs: urea, MAP, potash, diesel, and then right below interest. So the program is established with a specific quantity per acre of each of those inputs subject to price change. That'll be static during the insurance year. For example, urea, 203.43 pounds per acre on average would be numbers that are reflective of a Cass County spring wheat crop. Diesel, 4.81 gallons per acre. So those are set. And if you move over to the right side, you can see those pounds per acre just roll over. What does change is that we have a projected price for each of those inputs subject to price change that's announced in the fall by September 15th. And these are actual prices that were established for spring wheat for Cass County, North Dakota in the program for 2016. Convert the tonnage price to a price per pound, essentially, for the urea, MAP, and potash, a price per gallon for diesel, and then a interest cost as well. So the projected price per pound, projected price per pound for urea is 0.1377, MAP 0.2060, and so on. Multiply the quantity per acre times the price per unit, you get a total cost. This is an expected cost for these inputs or variable inputs at the beginning of the insurance year. You total those up, you get $53.77. You add the variable and fixed costs together, multiplied by an interest calculation that's also determined through the margin price provision document. It was 6.7% for spring wheat in Cass County. You add $4.40 worth of interest, and you have total cost with interest of $131.78. Total revenue, $284.43. Total expected cost for margin protection for every producer in Cass County, $131.78. Subtract cost from expected revenue, you get an expected margin, $152.64. That expected margin essentially is published in RMA's actual document books before sales closing for the crop year. Then the only differences between producers in a pilot county is what coverage level they choose. They can choose up to 90% Coverage level in this example, this producer selected 90% of the expected margin. So the trigger margin is $137.38. So if the harvest margin at the end of the year, which is going to be modified by the harvest prices for the input subject to price change and the commodity, that falls below $137.38, the payment would kick in. Total premium and producer paid premium with the subsidy included is $12.64. There's also a premium credit if the producer buys a base policy. I didn't calculate that on here, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so everybody in Cass County has an expected margin of $152.64 to purchase up to 90% of that. And we go through the crop year. So at harvest time, we're going to calculate a harvest revenue and a harvest cost. And we're going to subtract harvest cost from harvest revenue, and that's going to be your harvest margin. And if that harvest margin falls below the trigger margin, the payment will kick in. So end of the year, RMA announced, and these numbers, the expected county yield and the harvest prices are just numbers I made up for purposes of this example. But we're going to assume that RMA announced a final county yield, which would be the same yield if air and risk protection insurance is available in Cass County, which I think it is. That would be the same yield that RMA would publish for the Area Risk Protection Insurance Program. We're going to assume that the county yield went up slightly from the expected county yield. The expected county yield was 50.7 bushels. The final county yield came in at 51. And we're going to assume the harvest price based on the margin price provision document actually went from $5.61 down to $5.05. So there was a downward movement in prices during the insurance year. Hence, the producer's harvest revenue fell to $257.55. The expected $284.43 if you look at the left-hand column. Okay, the next group of rows on the right side are all your fixed input costs. They just roll over from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So you still have $73.62 worth of fixed costs. Now you have the 4 inputs that are subject to price change plus the interest calculations. The quantity or pounds or gallons per acre stays the same. The price per ton based off of price discovery in the fall or late summer in this case are shown on this slide. Again, these are just numbers I selected. So you can see the actual price per ton drop for this example. Urea went from went up, urea went from $275.48 a ton to $306.89 a ton. MAP also went up, potash went up, diesel went up a penny. So if you do the math, the quantity times the price, the total variable input cost at harvest time went up from $53.77 up to $58.40. So there was some slight movement up in cost, which ultimately reduces the margin, obviously. It costs more for those inputs than we expected it to cost based on the numbers in the county. Do the interest calculation off of total fixed and variable cost. Total cost with interest, $136.42. You subtract harvest cost from harvest revenue, and you end up with a harvest margin, which is the second to the last row on the right-hand side of $121.13. The trigger margin was $137.38 in this case. So the last payment per acre for this grower was $16.25. So I hope that gives you some kind of context. What we're doing with this program is establishing county yields, and we're establishing a quantity per acre. And then we're establishing projected prices for the commodity and projected prices for inputs subject to price change. And we're looking for movement in those different variables to see if, in fact, the producer's margin would change during the insurance year in any kind of indemnity kick in. So that's an overview. And we'll get into some of the specifics, kind of more further define some of those elements, and then come back and go through this example again. Continuing on with the introduction to margin. Margin protection can be purchased as a standalone program, or it can be purchased with a base MPCI revenue or yield protection insurance plan. We believe, and I believe that most producers are going to buy this with a base MPCI policy. If a producer buys a base policy, which we assume they will, that base policy and the margin protection policy both have to be with QBE and AU. There's no restriction with regards to the agent or agency, however, but the policy, both the base policy and the margin protection policy have to be with the same insurance company. If a producer buys a base MPCI policy, there's going to be a premium credit on that policy. That premium credit essentially is going to be reflective. I'm going to get this off my screen a little bit here. There's a premium credit is applied if a producer buys a yield protection, revenue protection policy, because any indemnity payment from that base policy is going to offset any payment on the margin protection policy. So essentially, your base policy becomes your primary insurance. We'll calculate a margin protection indemnity. We'll subtract from that any kind of indemnity the producer gets from an MPCI base policy. And if the result is greater than zero, then the additional indemnity payment would be paid to the grower. Producers may buy any other kind of endorsement available for the base policy other than the high-risk alternative coverage endorsement and the supplemental coverage endorsement. CAT coverage levels not available on margin. However, a base policy can be at the CAT level. Producers can buy any other kind of private crop insurance policy not reinsured by the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, crop hail, named peril products, or anything else. Those policies won't have any impact on the margin protection policy. If the producer is a beginning farmer or rancher and qualify for that additional subsidy would apply to margin protection as well as the MPCI policy. And if they're in the native sod area and are impacted by the native sod subsidy decrease, that subsidy decrease would also apply for any acreage insured under the margin protection policy. Insurable acres, margin is going to basically insure all acres that are insured under the base MPCI policy, or if they don't have a base policy, all acres planted to that crop for that type of practice that's insurable in the county. Planted to the insured crop on or before the final planting date, reported to the company by the acreage reporting date, certainly physically located in the county shown on the application, accepted by the company, and that county has to have margin protection available in the county, and then planted to a type of practice designated as insurable in the actual document. There are no replanting payment provisions. If a producer wants a replanting payment, certainly they would obtain that through the base policy, revenue or yield-based policy. Margin does not provide for any acreage that is eligible for a preventive planting payment under the terms of the basic provisions. Again, producer was interested in preventive planting coverage, they would obtain that through a base policy. And the late planting provisions of the basics are not applicable to margin. However, important to understand the final planting dates. If you look in the actual documents for margin protection, the final planting dates take into account the late planting period under the base policy. So if there was a county that had a May 30th final planting date and the crop provision provided for a 25-day late planting period, the final planting dates listed for margin protection would already take into account an additional 25 days for that late planting period. And those dates are published in RMA's actual documents. And then finally, on this slide, no written agreements are allowed for margin protection. However, there's no restrictions on written agreements on the base policy. Units, I won't get in much into this. It's an area plan essentially, so units really don't have that much of an impact. It's going to be a payment per acre based on the yields and the prices established by RMA. However, reporting to RMA, the company must report on a margin unit, and that unit is going to be consistent with the unit established for the producer under their MPCI policy, if in fact they have one. And that's essentially what this is saying here. Acreage reports, Producer has a base policy. We will take their acreage report from that base policy to establish their margin protection coverage. If they don't have a base policy, the producer would have to report acreage commensurate with the terms of Section 6 of the basic provisions, which is just the acreage report provisions. Production reports, we're going to use the production reports off of the base policy to establish the approved yield, which is simply used for margin protection purposes to establish a maximum amount of liability for this policy. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail here in a couple of slides. Bottom line is no additional work for the grower with regards to approved yields if they have a base policy. If they don't have a base policy, which I don't guess we're going to have any of those, or maybe a very minor number, they would have to do a production report at the end of each crop year, just like they would under an area risk protection policy. Projected and harvest prices. Pricing information follows the design of the commodity exchange price provisions via the margin price provision document. The margin price provision document specify how and when the margin projected prices and the margin harvest prices will be determined for each commodity. For each of those specific inputs subject to price change. Again, kind of a section 1, very general, includes all the acronyms and definitions that are applied on all of the tables. Section 2 is the commodity information, price discovery for each commodity that's currently insured under the margin protection program. And then section 3 is a new section that we specify all of the price discovery periods and tables for all of the variable inputs that are measured in the margin protection program. And the margin insured must elect 100% of all prices under margin protection. Price discovery periods for projected prices of inputs are very similar to the projected price discovery periods for the commodities. Allows the expected margin to be calculated on the basis of current market expectations for both the commodity prices and the input. And that's again in the fall, late summer, early fall, ahead of the crop year, the producer's planning to grow the crop. That's when we're going to be setting those prices and those yields. The price discovery period for harvest prices of inputs generally occurs a little earlier than the harvest price discovery periods for the commodities, largely because a fairly high percentage of the quantity of inputs needed to produce the crop are associated with planting in the few weeks immediately following the timing of harvest. Price discovery essentially intended to broadly represent the timing of purchase and use of those production inputs. Okay, a little bit more specific. We've touched on raw incomes in that early example overview, but they're the resources typically used to produce the insured crop in the county where the insured acreage is located. Now, we're aware that there's a lot of other inputs than the ones that are being used in margin protection that a producer uses to get his crop up and go. But these are the specific inputs that were selected to measure for these programs. And they were selected again by local economic people from ag universities, extension economists, and those types of folks that put those production budgets together for growers. There's two types of allowed inputs, which I've already focused on a little bit. Those subject to price change and those that are not. Subject to price change are the variable input. Those not subject to price change are the fixed input. This slide just shows those allowable inputs by crop that have been selected, and you will see tables on in section 3 of the margin price provision document for each of these crops. They're all specified and identified with an average quantity per acre that's listed under the price discovery tab on RMA's website. So for corn, those variable inputs that are being used for margin protection are diesel interest, DAP, urea, and potash. Soybeans, diesel interest, DAP, and potash. Urea was not included. Rice, diesel interest, urea, DAP, and potash. And wheat, diesel interest, urea, MAP, and potash. So those are all the inputs that essentially we've identified a specific quantity for, or RMA has, and we will project the price and then record a harvest price to see if the cost of those inputs goes up or goes down. These are all the fixed inputs by crop that are currently being used under margin protection. These are pre-specified. There'll be a specific dollar amount per acre that will be established ahead of self-closing for each of these specific inputs for each of these crops for margin protection. Won't read those to you. You can kind of see those on the slide, for example, for corn, pre-harvest machinery, seed, lime, herbicide, and insecticide cost. County yields, we are going to measure, of course, for projected revenue and harvest revenue, an expected county yield and a final county yield. That expected yield is established for each insured crop type practice. Essentially, is the same number used for RP, but lagged 1 year. For example, for 2017, the yield will be the one used for RP for 2016, and that will apply for corn, soybeans, and spring wheat. Rice will be actually matched up with RP. And the reason there's a lag year in establishing that expected county yield is we are establishing that in September, the year before the year of insurance, so we wouldn't have 2016 summarized data available yet to be able to use 2016. The expected county yield is also used for standalone policies for purposes of determining the amount of insurance, the maximum dollar amount of insurance and liability under margin protection. Final county yield, essentially bottom line is if you have RP, if there's RP for that crop in that county, that final county yield should be exactly the same for margin protection as the area risk protection insurance. Yield established for each insured crop type and practice. Final county yield, as I mentioned, be the same as that released for RP. Data sources and so on are all defined in the actual documents as well. So if anybody's interested in that, go into the RMA actual document tool, click on corn or soybeans or spring wheat, click on the correct tab, and you can pull that information down. So we'll define the basis of coverage and indemnities here in this next section of slides. So essentially, everything starts with an expected margin. That expected margin is going to be published in RMA's actuarial documents just as soon as they can after the price discovery period, the projected price discovery period in the fall. Expected margin is simply subtracting expected cost from expected revenue. The producer can choose up to between 70 and 90% of the expected margin for in every one of the counties and every one of the crops under the pilot program. So, expected revenue, very simply, is the expected county yield for that crop type and practice multiplied by the margin projected commodity prices, which is based off of that table that's shown in the margin price provisions document. We've already talked about same as area yield, essentially on the line 1 year, and so on. Margin projected price is established as determined by the price provisions. We're going to assume, we'll do a little example here. It doesn't correspond specifically with the example I did at the beginning, and we'll close with a little bit easier example to walk through a description of how margin works. We're going to assume an expected county yield for corn of 150 bushels per acre in this county in Iowa, and a $4 per bushel projected price for corn. Expected revenue simply multiplying yield times price. You end up with this producer, all these producers in this county would be expecting roughly $600 per acre. And that'll be a starting point for determining the producer's trigger margin. You subtract off of that is expected cost. The expected cost essentially defined as a dollar amount determined by multiplying the quantity of each allowed input subject to price change by the projected input price for that input. We're going to add that to that dollar amount for the fixed inputs essentially to determine expected cost. We're going to assume only two variables, actually three with the fixed input cost. So again, I've shortened this a little bit, but we're going to assume for this crop, we have diesel fuel. The quantity has been established at 7.5 gallons per acre at the beginning of the year, and that will remain constant. Nitrogen, 150 pounds per acre. Again, that will remain constant. And the fixed input costs, we're going to assume are $300 per acre. These are just, again, arbitrary numbers. So RMA has established the input quantities for the variable inputs. Then they project the prices. And we're going to assume that they projected a diesel price in September of $3.50. Again, that's a September ahead of the crop season. So your total estimated or expected diesel cost per acre in this county would be $26.25. We're going to assume they project a price of $1 for nitrogen. There's already a pre-established quantity of 150 pounds per acre times $1 is $150 per acre in nitrogen cost. Add those two numbers to the fixed input numbers of 300. You have total expected cost of $476.25. So expected revenue minus expected cost equal expected margin. You do the math. This county, in this example, we would have an expected margin of $123.75. And we're going to assume this producer buys a 90% margin protection coverage level. You take the expected margin times 90%, and you come up with a trigger margin of $111.38. We're going to show you real quickly liability calculations. We don't want to get too bogged down in this. It basically just establishes an upper limit on the MP indemnity payments using either the approved actual production history yield if a producer has a base policy or the county expected yield for standalone policies, and a maximum coverage level of 85% on any kind of base policy. So essentially what we're trying to do here is saying, okay, if a producer had a maxed out their NPCI policy, which would be 85%, and they maxed out their loss on that NPCI policy, and they then again maxed out their loss on margin protection, we're going to establish an amount that we don't want those two numbers to go over. We can't insure more than the crop is worth. And this is simply trying to establish a maximum amount of coverage that we're going to compare his final loss numbers to see to make sure we don't exceed. We don't anticipate these numbers ever being hit or on very, very, very small occasions perhaps, but these are essentially maximum liability calculations. We just do a comparison at the end of the year on, and I'll show you that. Well, this is an example with the base policy. We're going to assume in our example, we were just going through, this is a 500 acre unit. We're going to assume a approved yield of 160, a coverage level of 85%, margin projected price of $4, trigger margin of $111.38. You add all of that up. So if they maxed everything out with a $4 projected price and a $111 trigger price, the insurance amount per acre would be $655.38 times the number of acres. So the most this margin protection policy can